The morning I found that harebell standing back in its soil, I sat on my heels for a long time and did not move. Pepper sat beside me with her chin lifted, ears forward, reading something in the air at the meadow's north edge that I could not read myself. I had pulled that plant the afternoon before. I had marked the bare spot in my field notebook with a penciled X and a note about the misidentification, and I had moved on. Now the plant was back, rooted and upright, the bell-shaped flowers a clean pale violet against the June grass, and the soil around its base was tamped smooth in a way that spoke of hands, or something like hands, working with patience I had not expected to find at 6,200 feet in the northern Cascades. I want to be honest with you about what I am. I am a botanist. I have spent 37 years classifying what I can see and measuring what I can touch, and I have always been suspicious of stories that ask you to believe more than the evidence supports. What I'm about to tell you is the evidence. You can do with it what you want. To understand what that replanted harebell meant, I need to go back to the week before I drove the logging road in. My wife Clara died in December, 18 months before that June. She had been sick for about a year before the end, and I had been present for all of it, which is both the right thing to say and the hardest thing to carry. When someone you have lived beside for 31 years is gone, the world does not become empty so much as it becomes wrong-sized. The kitchen felt too large. The bed felt too large. The university office I returned to in January, with its filed specimens and its rolling carts of reference volumes, felt somehow too small for what I was trying to fit into a working day. I catalogued. I wrote reports. I answered emails with one eye on the clock, because the only part of the day I could manage with any reliability was the part I spent at a desk with a task in front of me. Clara had kept a kitchen herb garden in pots along the south-facing windowsill, and she had kept 4 pressed flower notebooks going back to the early years of our marriage, the pages soft and faintly aromatic still. The specimens mounted with small paper hinges she cut herself from index cards. Mountain harebell Campanula rotundifolia appeared in 3 of those 4 notebooks. She had a particular attachment to it. She said once that it was the most honest wildflower she knew, because it bloomed in places that were hard to reach, and it did not seem to need anyone's approval to do it. I had not opened those notebooks since November. They were on the shelf in the study above her seed catalogues, and I had walked past the shelf every day without taking them down. I accepted the survey contract in late May, partly because my supervisor, Dale Hutchins, had been quietly steering useful work my way for 6 months, and I did not want to keep refusing it, and partly because the contract required me to be somewhere without a calendar. The anniversary of Clara's death would fall in the 2nd week of December, but the anniversary I could not face was the anniversary of the last good day we had together. A Saturday in early June when she had been well enough to walk in the yard and we had eaten lunch on the porch, and she had told me something about the light that I had been trying to remember clearly ever since and could not quite get back to. That anniversary was coming, and the Cascades were far enough away that I thought I might not notice it arrive. Dale called the morning I finished packing. "The meadow's in good shape for this time of year," he said. "You should have full early bloom through day 3 at least. 41 species in the preliminary list, but it's preliminary. You'll find more." He paused. "You doing all right, Roy?" "I'm fine," I said. "I'll check in on day 3. He let the pause run a beat longer than was strictly necessary, which was his way of saying he did not quite believe me, but was not going to press. "Check in on day 3, he agreed, and hung up. The drive to the trailhead took 4 hours, the last 40 minutes on a logging road that had not been graded recently, the truck lurching through ruts that Pepper slept through with her head on the back seat and her grey muzzle pointed at the ceiling. She was 11 years old by then, which is old for a border collie, and she had developed the old dog's talent for conserving her attention for what actually mattered and ignoring everything else. I had brought her partly for the company and partly because I do not sleep well alone in a tent anymore, and her weight at the foot of the sleeping bag was something I had come to depend on in a way I would not have admitted to anyone who asked directly. The hike-in was 2 miles on a trail that gained about 800 feet, and the meadow opened up at the top of it in a way that stops you regardless of how many times you have come through similar terrain. Subalpine meadows at 6,200 feet have a quality of light that is different from anything below treeline. The sky sits closer. The colors of the wildflowers are cleaner because there is less air between them and the sun. I stood at the meadow's edge for a moment with my pack on my back and let myself feel what it was doing to me, which was something I had not done with any landscape in 18 months. Then I put the feeling away and started looking for a flat place to pitch the tent. The meadow was roughly oval, maybe 200 yards at its longest, bordered to the north by a band of old-growth fir and hemlock that came down from the ridge in a dense, dark wall. The south and east edges were open, grading into talus and krumholtz. The preliminary species list Dale had sent was accurate as far as it went, but I could see already that it had missed some of the sedge variations near the north edge, and the phlox coverage in the center was more diverse than the list suggested. I set up camp at the meadow's south end, ate the first of my 9 days of dehydrated meals, and sat outside the tent in the last of the evening light, while Pepper moved in small, calm circles near the camp, reading the ground. I started working systematically on day 1. I sectioned the meadow into a rough grid in my field notebook and worked west to east across each row, photographing, noting, and tagging specimens with small numbered flags I would collect on the last day. By the end of day 2, I had logged 23 species, which was ahead of the pace I needed. By the end of day 4, I was at 41, matching Dale's preliminary count, and I had already found 4 additional species he had not included. 2 of them variants I would need to check against the herbarium reference when I got back. It was during day 3 that I first noticed what Pepper was doing near the north edge. I had given her the run of the meadow, as I usually do when I am working open ground. She moves well in field conditions. She does not chase wildlife. She stays within earshot. But on day 3, late in the afternoon, I looked up from a patch of subalpine buttercup to find her sitting at the far north edge of the meadow, about 30 yards from the tree line, ears up and forward, her body still in a way that was different from her normal resting stillness. The difference was difficult to name. When Pepper is simply at rest, there is a looseness to her shoulders. When she is alert to a potential threat, a bird or a marmot, her hackles rise slightly and her chin drops. When she was sitting at the north edge that afternoon, her hackles were down and her posture was what I can only describe as attentive without being watchful. The way a dog sits near someone it knows rather than near something it is assessing. I called her back. She came without protest, but she glanced back twice on the way. I did not think much of it that day. Dogs read things we cannot read, and the north edge was where the meadow butted up against old-growth timber that almost certainly held bear and deer and whatever else moved through that drainage. I noted it in my field journal as a behavioral observation, which is a habit I developed early in my career and have never entirely broken. If something is happening and I do not know what it is, I write it down. The writing does not explain the thing, but at least it gives me something to check against later. On day 5, I made the mace identification. I was working through a stretch of ground near the meadow's northwest edge, where the soil was slightly damper, and the plant community was transitioning from the dry meadow phlox and yarrow to the wet edge sedges and rushes. I came across a single harebell I did not immediately recognize as Campanula rotundifolia. It was blooming early, which threw me off, and the leaves near the base were broader than I expected, which is a characteristic that can indicate the invasive Campanula rapunculoides under certain soil conditions. The rapunculoides has been spreading into subalpine habitats in this part of the Cascades for the past decade, and I had been specifically asked to flag any suspected invasives in this contract. I pulled the plant. I extracted the root system carefully, photographed it, and marked the bare spot in my notebook with a penciled X, the notation, possible C. Rapunculoides, root system intact, collected for comparison, and the time, which was 2:17 in the afternoon. I bagged the specimen and moved on. By that evening, back at camp with better light and my hand lens, I realized my mistake. The root system was not right for rapunculoides. The leaves, which I had read as broad in the field, were well within the natural variation range for rotundifolia at this elevation. I had pulled a native mountain harebell. I made a correction in my field notebook, wrote a note to myself to reset the specimen in the morning if the root ball was still viable, and ate my dinner in the dim light of the tent, feeling the particular mild irritation of a professional error that was small enough not to matter much and large enough not to entirely leave me alone. I want you to know that I also felt something else that I did not write in the field notebook. When I understood what I had pulled, I thought of Clara. I thought of the pressed harebells in her notebooks, the ones she had mounted with such care on those small, hinged paper frames, and I felt the familiar wrongness of the too large world come up in my chest, the way it did sometimes in the evenings, without warning, in the space between tasks. I did not stay with it. I put the lid on the specimen bag and zipped the tent and went to sleep. The next morning, I went back to the spot with the specimen bag at 6:45. Pepper walked with me across the damp morning grass, her feet dark to the ankle from the dew. The harebell was already there. It was standing in the soil exactly where I had pulled it, rooted and upright. The flowers closed against the morning chill the way harebells close, the stem straight. The soil around its base was pressed smooth in a narrow ring, the kind of ring you would make if you worked carefully around a root ball with your fingertips, tamping each side in turn. I crouched down and looked at the soil for boot prints. I found my own prints from the previous afternoon, the tread of my Dana work boots clear in the soft ground. I found no other prints of any kind within 2 feet of the plant on any side. I straightened up and looked at the tree line. The trees were still. The light was the flat, pale, early morning light of a June day in the Cascades. Not yet warm, the sky a grey-white through the fir tops. There was no wind. The meadow was entirely quiet. And Pepper was sitting beside me with her ears up and her hackles flat, and her expression of calm attention directed at the north edge of the meadow, not at the plant, not at me. I have spent my career being careful about what I claim to know. So I will tell you my first explanation, and I will tell you why it failed. My first explanation was that I had not fully pulled the plant the previous afternoon, and that it had righted itself overnight, as roots do sometimes when the extraction is shallow. I knelt and checked the root ball. The primary root had been fully extracted. I remembered doing it. The root system I had photographed was complete and intact, and the plant in the soil in front of me had a complete and intact root system beneath it. The same plant had been removed and replaced. That was the physical fact. My second explanation was that another field researcher was working the same drainage and had found the flagged bare spot and reset the specimen as a professional courtesy without leaving a note. I had seen it happen once in 37 years. I spent the morning watching the meadow's access trail and saw no one. I checked my radio to confirm I was the only contracted researcher in the permit area. I was. My third explanation was that an animal had disturbed the soil, and the plant had appeared to be replanted when in fact it had simply settled. I have some knowledge of what animal activity looks like in subalpine soil. The tamped ring around the root base was not the work of hooves or claws or the blunt passage of a bear's paw. It was deliberate and symmetric and careful, and the more I looked at it, the less comfortable I was with any category I owned. I wrote in my field notebook, in the margin beside the correction from the night before, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than my normal hand, the words, "Reset, origin unknown." Then I went back to work because I did not know what else to do. If you have had a moment in your own life when the world offered you something you had no category for, you know what the next 3 days felt like. I kept working. I kept logging species and photographing specimens and advancing the systematic grid. I reached 49 species by the end of day 7, which was well above the contract's expected deliverable. And in the space between tasks, I paid attention. The way you pay attention when something you cannot name has established itself at the edge of your awareness, and you are not yet ready to look at it directly. On day 6, late afternoon, I noticed that the sedges along a 10-foot stretch of the north edge had been bent back from the tree line, not broken. Bent, the way you bend tall grass when you push through it, slowly and carefully. The bent line was consistent in direction, inward towards the meadow, and the stalks had not snapped. Whatever had moved through had been careful about it. I measured the width of the bent corridor against my arm span and found it was roughly twice the width of my shoulders. On day 7, I found a cluster of flowers arranged near the base of my specimen, flagging stake at the meadow's center. They were not arranged in any elaborate way. They had been set down in a small group, stems together, the way you might set flowers down when you are carrying them and need your hands for something else. Yarrow, alpine phlox, and one harebell. The harebell was not the one I had pulled and replaced. It was a different specimen, freshly picked, the stem still holding moisture at the cut end. I took a photograph. I wrote the description in my field notebook. I was aware, writing it, that the description sounded like something I would have stopped reading if someone else had submitted it to me. That is the rational disbelief cycle the way it actually runs. You do not disbelieve dramatically. You disbelieve the way you proofread a document you wrote yourself, which is to say you keep finding yourself reading past the error because your mind insists it must be something correctable. It took me 3 days and 3 failed explanations and a cluster of flowers at a flagging stake to understand that I was done filing the evidence under possible errors and was instead standing in the middle of something I did not have a word for. Pepper had known since day 3. On day 8, I sat outside the tent at dusk and watched the north edge without trying to make myself stop watching it. The light went from gold to rose to the flat grey of early evening over the firs, and I sat with my hands around a cup of field coffee that had gone cold, and I just watched. Nothing came to the tree line. But the meadow's particular quiet during that hour was different from the quiet of the other evenings, a quality I could feel in my sternum before I could articulate it. The usual sounds were absent. The white-crowned sparrows that had been singing along the east edge each evening since I arrived were silent. The wind that typically picked up off the ridge at dusk was still. What remained was a quiet that felt occupied rather than empty, the way a room feels when someone has just left it, and the air has not yet settled back to its ordinary arrangement. I went to bed without understanding what I had felt. I lay in the sleeping bag with Pepper's weight at my feet and listened to the meadow for a long time before I slept. Day 9 arrived with a sky that had come in overnight, the light diffuse and soft through low cloud, the kind of June morning in the Cascades that smells of cold stone and wet fir and is more beautiful for being close and grey rather than open and bright. My last full day. I planned to work the remaining sections of the grid in the morning, break camp in the early afternoon, and hike out before the light went. I was at the north edge by 7:30, working through the final section of the sedge community, when Pepper moved away from my side. She walked toward the tree line at a steady pace, not the tentative pace she uses when she is uncertain, and she stopped about 15 feet from the firs and sat down with her tail moving in a slow, calm sweep against the ground. She did not look back at me. I stood up from where I had been kneeling. The trees were dense at the north edge, old-growth fir with trunks that ran 2 and 3 feet across, the understory below them dark and quiet. I stood and looked into that darkness, and I did not see anything at first. Then I became aware of a shape that the darkness had arranged itself around, the way darkness arranges itself around an object that is simply too large and too still to read as movement. The shape was set back from the tree line by perhaps 20 feet, and it was enormous, and it was not moving, and whatever it was watching me. I want to be precise here because precision is all I have. I did not see a clear outline. I did not see a face. What I saw was the unmistakable sense of mass, of presence, of a scale that was not animal in any category I could reach for, combined with a stillness that was deliberate rather than frozen. The way a person stands still when they are trying not to startle something. The way you hold yourself when you want to say, "I know you are here and I am not a threat." I stood at the meadow's edge and I did not move either. Pepper sat between us with her tail still sweeping and her ears at ease, and she did not make a sound. I do not know how long we stood that way. My mind kept trying to reach for categories and kept coming back empty, and after a while it stopped trying, and I just stood in the grey morning light, with the wet sedge against my boots and the cold air off the ridge on my face, and I let the moment be what it was. Something vast and deliberate was at the tree line, and it had been there, at the edge of my knowing, for most of 9 days, and it had been watching me work, and it had put a plant back in the ground that I had pulled out, and it had left flowers at a flagging stake, and it had done these things without any apparent need for me to understand them. I understood something in that moment that I have not been able to improve on since. Not about what the shape in the trees was, about myself. About 18 months of walking past a shelf of notebooks and not reaching for them. About a June Saturday and a quality of light I had been trying to remember and could not get back. About the way grief had settled into my professional competence, the way water settles into a low place and stays there, and how I had been calling that settlement survival when it was closer to a kind of stillness I had not chosen. I was not ready for that understanding. It arrived anyway. Then the shape in the trees moved. Not away, not yet. It moved forward into the narrow margin between tree line and open meadow, and for one moment it was in the light, the grey morning light, diffuse and soft, and I could see that it was tall, very tall, broad across the shoulders, dark, moving with a slowness that made the size of each step apparent. It stopped at the tree line's edge. It was perhaps 40 feet from where I stood. It was looking at me with a steadiness that I felt the way you feel the direction of wind before you hear it. Then it set something down. It bent slowly, and it placed something on the ground at the very edge of the meadow, at the precise line where the meadow grass ended and the fir needle mat began. Then it straightened, and it stood for one more moment, and it turned and moved into the trees, and the trees closed behind it, and the morning was ordinary again, all the way to the bone. Pepper got up and walked toward where it had stood. I followed her. At the tree line, on the flat of a root that curved above the surface of the ground like a worn step, there was a single mountain harebell, Campanula rotundifolia. The stem had been laid flat, the flowers intact, the root ball folded under the stem as if someone had tucked it in. The way you would press a flower to save it. The way you would place one in a notebook between two sheets of absorbent paper and close the cover and set it on a shelf to dry. Clara's species, Clara's exact gesture. I picked it up. I held it in my hands. I did not have a word for what I felt. I have been looking for one ever since. I stood there for what must have been several minutes. Pepper sat at my feet and leaned her shoulder against my shin. The cloud had thinned a little at the east end of the sky, and the light was coming up warmer, and the meadow behind me was brilliant with it. The phlox and the yarrow, and the 49 log species all catching the same morning and holding it in their own ways. I looked at the tree line where the shape had gone. The trees were still and dark and gave nothing back. Whatever it was gone, and it had not looked back, and it had not needed me to understand anything beyond what I was already holding in my hand. I broke camp slowly. I collected my flagging stakes and packed my reference materials and cleaned the site carefully. I took longer than I needed to, and I think that was right. I carried the harebell in my breast pocket for the hike out, wrapped in a piece of the waxed paper I use for sensitive specimens, the root ball slightly damp against the paper, the stem flexible still. The 2-mile hike down was the clearest I had felt in a year and a half. At the truck, I loaded the pack in the bed, put Pepper in the back seat, and sat in the cab for a moment before I started the engine. The logging road was quiet. The radio was off. I took out my phone. The signal was weak but present. 1 bar, and I looked at it for a while before I dialed. Neil answered on the 3rd ring. Dad. A pause. 2 years of distance in 1 word. Hey, I said. I'm coming down from the mountains. I wanted to call. He did not say anything immediately. I could hear him breathing. I know it's been a while, I said. It's been almost 2 years, Dad. I know. I looked at the dashboard. I'm sorry. I got quiet after your mother, and I'm sorry I took it out on the distance between us. The sentence came out less arranged than I had intended, and more honest than I deserved credit for. Another pause. Are you all right? Neil asked. Something happened up there, I said. I'll tell you about it when I see you, if you'll let me come. A longer pause. I listened to it, without filling it. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, come. I drove out. The logging road was still rough, and Pepper slept through it again, and the 4 hours back felt different from the 4 hours in. I could not have told you precisely how or why. The same road, the same truck, the same dog on the same back seat. I was a different weight in the seat than I had been driving in, and I think that is the closest I can get to a description. That was 9 months ago. Neil came for Thanksgiving. He brought his daughter, my granddaughter Maisie, who is 7 and who has a particular opinion about everything she encounters, delivered with the certainty of someone who has not yet been asked to be less sure of herself. She found Clara's pressed flower notebooks on the shelf in the study on her first afternoon in the house, and carried them to where I was sitting, and said, "What are these?" And I told her they were her grandmother's, and instead of putting them back, she sat down beside me and opened the first one and began working through it with the seriousness of a professional. I sat with her for an hour. I had not opened those notebooks in 18 months. Maisie found the harebells in all 3 of the notebooks that contained them, and she pointed to each one and said, "Is this the same flower each time?" And I said yes, more or less. It is a species called mountain harebell. And she considered this and said, "I think Grandma really liked that one," which is the most accurate natural history observation I heard all year. The pressed harebell from the meadow is in the 4th notebook now. I prepared it the way Clara prepared all the others, with paper hinges cut from index card stock, mounted on the right-hand page with a small notation in pencil, giving the collection location and the elevation. North Edge, Subalpine Meadow, Cascades, 6,200 feet approximately. The notation does not include the full account of how it came to me. The notebook is not the place for that. I went back to work in the fall. I submitted the survey report, which came in at 49 species against the preliminary estimate of 41. And Dale called to say it was the most thorough single researcher subalpine report he had received in several years, which is not a boast, just a fact I'm including because it tells you something about how those 9 days were spent. I did the work. I paid attention. And the thing that was watching me paid attention in return, and I have tried in the months since to be worthy of that, in small ways, in the daily texture of getting on with things. I do not know what was in that meadow. I have some ideas about the geography, about the age of the old-growth timber at the north edge, about what that kind of undisturbed terrain can shelter that we have not formally documented. I have turned those ideas over in my mind more times than I should admit. They do not resolve into anything I can put in a report. What I know is this. Something in that meadow noticed what I had done, and it noticed why it mattered, and it gave back a gesture so specific to the shape of what I had lost that coincidence is the explanation I can least afford. It did not need my gratitude. It did not wait for my understanding. It put a plant back in the ground and left a flower at a threshold, and walked back into the trees, and the trees closed, and the meadow went on being the meadow. The notebooks are on the shelf in the study. All 4 of them, where they belong. Pepper is at my feet as I write this, grey-muzzled, her breathing slow and even in the particular way of an old dog at rest. She is 11 years old and she has less interest every season in things that do not matter, which is a kind of wisdom I am still working toward. On the day she sat between me and the tree line with her tail moving in that slow, calm sweep, and her hackles flat, she was not afraid. I think she understood something I did not, the way dogs understand things before we do, not through reasoning, but through a clarity of attention that we spend years of formal education learning to work around. There is a quality of light on a Saturday morning in early June, in a yard where the herbs are coming in on the south-facing sill, and the porch is still cool, and someone you love is well enough to sit outside with you. I have been trying to remember it clearly for 2 years, and I have mostly failed. But I am closer than I was. I think that is allowed to be enough. The notebook is on the shelf. The harebell is on the page. Pepper breathes. I have stopped trying to explain what I saw, and I have not stopped being glad it was there.